predominant religion it happens to be in whatever country and so forth. So when you're talking about secularism, there are varieties of secularism across the world. For example, when you're talking about secularism in an Anglo-American context, really the focal point of secularism, say in the United States, is a notion of separating church and state, this institutional separation. And in fact, our legal regime is such that, say, the strict separationist sort of regime in American jurisprudence was pretty much mid-20th century, and we've been moving away from that. Today we've been going more back to the historical norm where it's acceptable for the government to support religion as a whole, but not discriminate between various different denominations. On the other hand, you can contrast that with the idea of, say, for example, laïcité in France. Now, the predominant religion, Christian religion in France is, of course, Catholicism, which is a different animal than a whole bunch of Protestant denominations. So the French have historically, French Republicans, French secular liberals, have been much more insistent on a stronger version, not just of church-state separation, but actually of keeping religion out of public spheres entirely. So say that, for example, when you go into a school, you're supposed to remove all religious symbols and so forth. It doesn't matter if it's a Christian symbol, Jewish symbol, Muslim symbol, and so forth. And generally, interestingly enough, French secularism, laïcité, tends to get a really bad press in the United States, even among academics. We tend to think of this as a rather oppressive way of doing things. Also, India. India has been a sort of a secular democracy, well, rather eroded by the rise of Hindu nationalism for a while right now, but they've had long decades of practice with a sort of secular way of doing things. So it's not just sort of a Western European derivatives kind of thing, secularism. And interestingly enough, and this is something that people very often overlook, Muslim countries, the Muslim world as a whole, actually has had a long experience with secularism of its own variety. So say, for example, again, if we're talking about the Muslim world 50 years ago, or even back earlier into the 20th century, your image of Muslim politics would have been very different. So books written in, say, like the 1950s and so forth, would have described the Muslim world as being on a path to secularization like, say, Eastern European countries, where religion was losing its public grip. And you had people in charge in places tend to be like this image of Kemal Atatürk from Turkey, from probably, this is from the late 20s or early 30s, very much in Western dress. And this was a somewhat authoritarian regime at the time, but it was also very much a westernizing, very insistently French-style secularizing regime. So Turkey's had a long history with attempts to secularize. And Arab nationalism used to be very much politically very important in Arab countries, but the images that we have of Arab nationalism today are people like Saddam Hussein, or more recently, people like Bashar Assad. And indeed, Arab nationalism really has devolved into very authoritarian kleptocratic regimes. These really are the images of secularism in the Arab world. And so therefore what we have with the long Muslim experience with secularism is an experience with a failed secularism. And that matters, because largely what you have when you talk about secularism in Muslim context, very often what people are first going to think about is the examples that are closest to them, obviously, and this is going to be some sort of kleptocracy or even outright dictatorship. So because of this, in Muslim countries, secularism has a very thin public base. It's very difficult to go out if you're a political party leader and so forth in a Muslim country and ask for votes and say, we're going to be more secular. Secularism is the answer to our political ills and so forth. You're going to lose the election if you do that. And Muslim majorities typically, and again, I'll sort of flash briefly some Pew data for you, they generally support a public entanglement with religion to a degree that's much higher than what we're used to, say, in Western Europe or North America. So there's a lot of public support for having religion involved to some degree. This does not mean, by the way, that Muslim populations are very enthusiastic about, say, letting clerics run the state. They're not. There are other ways to make religion involved rather than having a theocracy. Okay? And also, interestingly enough, of course, history is very important in these things. In the past, when you're talking about the first wave of independence of Muslim countries, which for Turkey happened in the 1920s, and for many of the Muslim countries, decolonization followed World War II. Usually the first generation of leaders in Muslim countries have typically been military characters, and they sort of set up sort of semi-authoritarian regimes that eventually made transitions to democracy. But secularization was part of their political package. So you have a history of militaries actually supporting secularism in Muslim countries. But in recent decades, this has actually inverted itself. So for example, in recent decades in Turkey, actually the military has been a force for desecularization in Turkey. And you can say similar things about, say, Egypt, Pakistan, Indonesia, and so forth too. So the role of the military has pretty much inverted. They have undermined secularism, starting by supporting them first a generation or so ago. Okay, now when you describe this situation, if you talk to someone with sort of secular liberal political inclinations, the first worry that they're going to raise to you is, well, if you do not keep religion and state separate, if you do not have some sort of secular government, don't you have a theocracy over here? Aren't you really going to have priests and mullahs really dictating everything in your everyday life? Isn't this really an oppressive regime? And in fact, in the Muslim world today, it's fairly easy to find some fairly prominent examples of theocracies. Theocracies in the sense of clerics running the show. One of them is obviously Iran, and the other one, which would again be fairly close to American consciousness, is Saudi Arabia. However, outside of Iran and Saudi Arabia, actually the reputation of these countries among other Muslim populations is actually fairly low. There are very popular Islamist movements, political movements in the Muslim world today, but very few of them will actually hold up Iran as an ideal. Okay, you might say that's because Iran is Shiite and that's a minority position, but then again, Saudi Arabia is very much hyper-Sunni, but Sunni Islamist movements typically have very little that's positive to say about Saudi Arabia as a model either. So you should think about examples like Iran and Saudi Arabia as kind of outliers. These are not ideals for the Muslim world. They're almost anomalies in certain ways. By and large, what an Islamist party in a country like Malaysia or Turkey and so forth will want is going to be some version of perhaps religious nationalism, and they will very much insist on elections as the way of legitimating their rule. And also, they will very much emphasize in the context, when you're talking about freedom of religion, they will say very much about the freedom of religion, because very often they're looking back to recent history where they perceive themselves, and really were very often, oppressed by secular regimes that came before them. And therefore, they will very much emphasize freedom of religion, but not necessarily in an individual sense. What they really have in mind is more freedom of religious institutions from state control. And also, again, it's not an individual emphasis. This is not a Protestant environment where you tend to think of choosing your religion, making leaps of faith and things like that. In the Muslim world, largely, religion is still a bit of a community marker. So when you're thinking about freedom of religion among Muslims, very often you should think of the notion of freedom of communities to live properly according to their faith, according to their law, and so forth. This is what very often Islamist movements promise. Okay, fair enough. But then again, there's also this liberal ideal of neutrality. Shouldn't we say that, especially given the religious diversity in the world today, and even given in any given country today, shouldn't the state be neutral with respect to different religious persuasions? Okay, maybe, but as you might imagine, Islamists, who are actually very serious political thinkers, I mean, if you're looking for public political intellectuals in Muslim countries, very often they are in fact Islamists. And these are people you have to take seriously academically as well as everything else. And right now, they would probably come up with a rejoinder like this, saying that, okay, secular liberals promise neutrality, but this neutrality is a bit of a fake. It's not real neutrality. Because in the end, for the liberal neutrality to work, you must have liberal individualism be the dominant point of view in the population at large. So this is a demand for privatizing religion, taking religion out of the public sphere. And that will work very well if, say, for example, you belong to a liberal Protestant church, or you're the sort of in this kind of a hyper-individualistic, New Age type of spiritual path. But it's not necessarily going to work well, say, for example, if you're Greek Orthodox or conservative Catholic or conservative Muslim. Because their social ideal is not liberal individualism. And therefore, what we have when we talk about secular neutrality towards religion, in fact, is not neutral, the argument goes, towards moral communities and their associated unchosen affiliations. Liberals tend to make a fetish out of choice, choose this, choose that. The whole idea, very often, behind Islamist politics is to defend your affiliations, which are more akin to family and so forth, which are unchosen, which predetermine your identity. It's not something that you choose. And also, fairly obvious point over here is that when you have liberal public policy, very often, in the name of neutrality, this burdens conservative religious people. One prominent example that may resonate over here in the United States as well is arguments over evolution. Because arguments over creation versus evolution are not intellectual arguments, prominently speaking. Typically, these arguments are ignited by issues having to do with public education. That's the battleground. And think about, say, for example, arguments that you see from the religious right in the United States. There, the argument is that teaching evolution, say, for example, in a public high school means this. You are teaching with taxpayer dollars, you are teaching evolution, which is religiously offensive to a large segment of the community, and their only option they have, if they do not want their children to be influenced by this godless dogma of evolution, what they have to do is still pay their taxes like everybody else to fund the public schools, but then pay extra on top of it to send their kids to a private school. So in that sense, very often religious conservatives think of what liberals think of neutrality, for them is a burden, an extra burden on the conservatively religious. And this is not something you can just dismiss. It really is a burden. Okay, maybe neutrality is not quite what we advertised to begin with. Maybe the real reason maybe you want a sort of secular liberal political order is that it keeps the peace. After all, when we're talking about European history, very often the story we tell in our political philosophy is that Europe went through this Reformation and the Catholic Church splintered into 1,000 parts and you had warring sects all over the place. There were the wars of religion, and finally we established secular states, and now people don't go to war over religion anymore. Okay, one thing, actually that history is quite dubious. It's very much a sort of Whig history, kind of telling history according to the sort of what liberals want it to be sort of thing. It's not necessarily reality. The idea, however, here is this. People in Muslim countries are also cognizant of religious diversity. Usually, if you go to, say, many Muslim countries, they might in some ways be more religiously diverse than what we're used to here in the United States. Because you have very different communities, very visibly different, not assimilated into the same business overall culture than compared to over here. And so the Muslim argument has very often been that we have our own historical experience, we have our own way to deal with pluralism and keep the peace between sects. And the conservative Muslim proposal is not to privatize religion, it's to think of countries as a community, not of individuals necessarily, but a community of religiously defined communities. And they will harken back often to historical examples such as the Ottoman millet system, where the empire was conceived of consisting of many different autonomous communities which ran typically their own affairs by their own religious law. And very often the ideal for Muslim political thinkers these days is to try and find some sort of 21st century version of the millet system. And in fact, this ties in very nicely to certain, what you might call postmodern conservative ideas that have gained large currency among political thinkers in Europe and North America as well. So it would end up emphasizing things like group rights sometimes over individual rights. And political philosophy for the last couple of decades is a very hot topic. And it very much plugs in nicely to this notion of a postmodern politics of recognition of groups and identities and so forth. So the Muslim claim very often is that we do this postmodern identity politics better than you liberals. Okay, and at the end of the day, liberals will still be bothered by this idea of a community of communities and everything like that. And it probably comes down to something like, however you're going to cut it, this goes against the notion of the freedom of the individual conscience. Culturally, we're all very much Protestant in that way. And however, in that way too, there are arguments that conservative Muslim political thinkers use today that resonate fairly closely with conservative political arguments that you will very easily find in the United States and Europe. For example, secularism these days is associated with statism, sort of an oppressive regime determining how people are going to live. You will find arguments to this effect not only among Islamist writers in, say, Cairo. You will find arguments to this effect among a lot of, say, more postmodern style political thinkers in the United States and so forth. Secularism actually in the United States Academy today has a very ambiguous reputation. Depending on who you talk to, it can have a very bad reputation or a very good reputation. It's very all over the map. So basically, you get the sort of very common conservative themes, which will be familiar to you from the United States, of something like secularism being statism, which is unacceptable because this is interference in spontaneous organization within societies. And examples of the spontaneous organization would be how people get together and form, say, for example, religious congregations without the state interfering with it, or markets without the state structuring them and so forth. And the idea then, of course, is that if you want big government out of your life, you probably want the big government imposing secularism out of your life as well. This kind of rhetoric tends to resonate to a certain degree, not exactly the same way, but it resonates to a certain degree in Muslim contexts as well. And also, one thing that is in common between both here and Muslim countries that historically have attempted some form of secularism is that eventually secularism ends up being a policy that's driven not by legislatures and democratically elected representatives and so forth, it ends up being driven by the courts. So say, for example, your stereotypical secular liberal in the United States will constantly be looking at the Supreme Court. And we want the Supreme Court to intervene to override popular interest in this sort of thing. And similar things have happened in, say, Turkey especially and all that. So the image of secularism in such contexts tends to be that it's non-democratic, it's sort of judicially imposed, and it's really sort of this technocratic, elitist way of doing things. And that tends to be the reputation of secularism in Muslim countries right now. So therefore, the big battleground sort of over thing is who gets to define this notion of religious freedom. You want a more liberal definition that emphasizes individual conscience? Or do we go with a more conservative notion of religious freedom? Which, by the way, is a very important political battle in the United States over the past decade as well. And here, the issue over here is that liberals tend to think of religions as private associations. It's like a golf club. You go and join, you pay your dues, you can leave when you want. However, socially, religion really does not behave like a golf club. Religions are not mere private associations. And so therefore, religious conservatives tend to want a political system that acknowledges that religions are not private associations. And in these ways, Muslim arguments are actually quite similar to what you will find in Western conservatism. So, which is kind of ironic in a way. Secular liberals, which is of course my political background, we tend to think of ourselves as very cosmopolitan, universal, not really tied into particular histories or ethnicities and things like that. Well, to counterpose to that, you have something like a conservative universalism today, in the sense that many political arguments that conservatives use right now are resonating in very different countries. Not just the United States, but also places like Turkey or India and so forth. Universalism comes in different flavors. Okay. So if you look at it at the level of arguments, we have certain liberal arguments about this whole thing, but very standard reasons about, say, theocracy, neutrality, and so forth. These really don't apply the way we think they should in a Muslim context. They really don't. You have to do something different. And one of the reasons they don't apply is that we have a different history and a different tradition of political theology in Muslim environments. You cannot just erase that and bring in some sort of universal notion of human rights or whatever you want to call them. It doesn't work that way. On top of that, in many places in the world, there's a very similar kind of postmodern conservatism, emphasizing markets, communities, moral hierarchies. Moral hierarchy is not a very popular concept among secular liberals, but very often is an important conservative religious concept. And emphasizing virtues such as obedience to religious authority that liberals tend to be very skeptical about. So we are talking about different moral universes as well as political ideals. Okay, well, what about the other liberal pieties? The whole idea of human rights, gender equality, secular government, freedom of religion, freedom of expression, and trying to avoid political violence. Well, no, I'm not going to talk about all of these things. That's what the book is all about. If you're interested in what I have to say about all of these other things, and these interlink in very interesting ways the arguments over these individual subjects, there's a reason the book is 350 pages long. There's a lot to say about that. So I'm not going to go into these. I'm going to start wrapping it up by trying and saying a few things about what it all might mean. Well, first of all, I'm hoping you might entertain the idea after today that a secular liberal framework for politics that we have tended to be used to in Western Europe and North America is not universally persuasive. It's not persuasive as arguments, and is certainly not persuasive as lived experience for many people in the world right now. Our arguments actually have turned into cliches, and they really don't touch lived experience very well at all very often. And especially when you talk about claims like non-coercion or neutrality, which are very central ideas in the liberal political tradition, whenever you hear these, you should actually start getting very suspicious. Politics is always a matter of winners and losers, and people's oxes are going to get gored. When you try and sell your political point of view by saying, no, I'm not going to coerce everybody, and I'm going to be perfectly neutral, probably you are coercing somebody, and you are not being neutral at all. So you want to be suspicious of that. So maybe the impression that you're getting, and it would be accurate, is that I'm defending a certain degree of disillusionment with secular liberal political frameworks. And maybe this is not too unusual a feeling for you, because you might ask the question today, what does secular liberalism really stand for anyway? Especially, say, for example, in an American political context, we just went through an election and everything like that. What does it stand for? A sort of technocratic liberalism, a kind of standing for the interests of the professional classes? Does it stand for, say, for example, humanitarian war? We'll go and bomb people, yes, but we'll do it for humanitarian reasons? I mean, what kind of political figures stand for secular liberalism today? People like Tony Blair? I mean, honestly, he probably does stand for secular liberalism as we have it today. Or Hillary Clinton? Probably yes. So it's kind of almost indistinguishable from a kind of status quo conservatism. Or, for example, a figure that nobody knows over here, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. He's the leader of the leading opposition party in Turkey. He will probably never win an election in his life. And he stands for exactly the same sort of policies of the sort of Tony Blair, Hillary Clinton, and everything like that. So what does secular liberalism stand for anyway today? And given such figures, conservative religion remains quite persuasive worldwide. In fact, it's growing. Sometimes in a place like the United States, we may get the wrong idea, in the sense that over the past generation especially, the United States has actually finally started to secularize in a way that's similar to Western Europe. A lot more, especially in the younger generation, people are not as attached to organized religion as a previous generation used to be. But that's happening here locally. Religion has already collapsed in Western Europe. But if you look at the world as a whole, demographically speaking and politically speaking, conservative religion is on the rise. So we are living in very unrepresentative societies in this respect. So then, what to do? Which is, of course, a very salient question for somebody like me. As I said, I come from a secular liberal background, both in my family and my life experience and everything like that. I teach at a liberal arts college in arts and sciences department, so I'm very almost over-determined to be a secular liberal. And that's very much true. But, of course, a lot of your personal political views, even though we might like to think of it, are not determined by a reasoning process or something like that. It has a lot more to do with, say, your personal temperament, your personal history, and so forth. And so, for example, if you've been able to listen to me for this time, and you have a conservative temperament, what I have to say to you mainly is that, yeah, right now it looks like you're victorious. Please don't blow it up for me. If, however, you have a more liberal temperament, then you're more like me in that respect. Well, the first thing you need to do is accept that we're looking at a global setback. No matter what might happen in, say, Western European or American societies, globally, liberal secular politics is on the back foot. And we should use this as a reason to rethink what we really want. What are we trying to accomplish by a secular liberal framework of politics? And I'll only drop one suggestion over here. I think if we're going to make any sort of secular liberalism viable in the future, we're going to have to get out of this habit of associating ourselves with neoliberal ways of doing politics and economics. And I'll leave it at there. If you're interested in reading more, please do so. That's what the book is all about. And later today, I will put slides of the talks online. So if you want to take a look at my slides again, they'll be on truman.academia.edu, my name, /talks. I'll make sure that later tonight or early tomorrow, it's going to be out there. That's it. I hope you have questions. I will stay here as long as you want me to answer questions.
And again, his book is for sale.
Yeah, they're flogging the book out there. If you want to get a copy and have me sign it, I'll do it. Why not?
We do have time for questions, so if anybody has questions. And I think Dr. Ennis is going to, you're going to take the questions.
I'll say, okay. Go, let's start with students maybe. Go ahead.
How would you suggest going into classrooms and teaching students from a variety of backgrounds, both maybe immigrants and Protestant students, about things like evolution and things that are in our curriculum?
I'm the wrong person to ask. Wrong person in this way. My teaching experience is obviously with college students, and I teach physics. So there's very little room in a physics classroom for this type of cultural controversy. It occasionally happens. For example, a couple of years ago, I was talking about quantum mechanics and the randomness in quantum mechanics. And one student put up her hand, and she came from a Muslim background, interestingly enough, and she said, "What about God?" Okay, now if you're a physics teacher and you're in that sort of situation, you do probably what I did. I sort of mumbled that sort of physics doesn't do God, and just move on to sort of your next equation or something like that. But on the other hand, I also like the student asking that question. At least she was actually thinking about making connections between what she was learning in physics with her other interests and background in life. So in some ways, I actually wanted to say, hey, good thing you raised that question. But I'm really not going to answer it. Now, yeah, I'm the wrong person, I'm sorry. I really don't have the experience that's relevant to it because my personal experience, I have the luxury usually of being able to ignore things like that. But if, say, for example, you're teaching biology in, say, a high school classroom, there, oh boy, then you're going to have to deal with lots of different cultural backgrounds, people for whom something like evolution is religiously offensive, and you're going to be much more exposed to community pressure in a way that I am not. You have a very different environment. You really need to ask somebody who knows about it. In one place I can direct you who knows about this sort of thing, the National Center for Science Education, ncsc.org. They're an organization that keep track of public controversies over science, and particularly in the context of high school education. They particularly specialize in creation-evolution disputes and controversies that erupt in schools over global warming. So get in touch with NCSC. They're really, really good people. And they will be able to get in touch with anybody you want who has much more real experience that can help you. It's not me.
Right, I was just wondering, because in my high school, they pretty much just said, oh, I know this doesn't go along with some of your religious beliefs, but this is what we're teaching for this lesson. You have to learn it for the test.
Okay. I would not do that. I probably would duck under the desk or something like that. They're way in the back. Let's not ignore.
In your book, you mentioned specifically Sam Harris,
Uh-huh.
who is a public intellectual who's kind of known for being particularly tough on Islam.
Right.
Do you think attacks on Muslim ideas like that actually increase Muslim piety?
Very often, yes. Very often, people define their identities by people who are attacking those identities. So, if, say, for example, you're Jewish, say, anti-Semitism is probably going to be a big thing to reinforce your Jewish identity. If you're Christian and you're under the sort of perception of being persecuted all the time, then, I mean, this is how people behave, yes. And if you take somebody like Sam Harris, it's quite likely that his type of attacks on Muslim beliefs would have an opposite effect on people who are already, to some degree, committed to Islam in the first place. However, my objection to Sam Harris doesn't really have anything to do with that. I think my objection to Sam Harris is that, academically speaking, he does a shit job of criticizing Islam. I mean, he really isn't. He hasn't done his homework. He doesn't know what he's talking about. And that bothers me. Go ahead.
This isn't quite directly related to this, but I was wondering about your opinion, or quite knowledgeable, like in general topic. The fascinating, it's kind of a cognitive dissonance between modern conservatism with Christianity and America criticize these Islamic countries for not accepting women's rights and not accepting science, but then you're seeing this new administration is kicking these scientific people off Twitter.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you've been following. I assume you do. Right. So the fact that this is existing at the same time is
okay. To try and evaluate something like this, it helps to have some historical context. And there's actually a very long history of Western colonial powers criticizing the gender situation in Muslim countries. So for example, about 100 years ago, you would have, say for example, the British colonial rulers of Egypt, say, when they were talking about the situation in Egypt back home among Europeans, they would say that these Egyptians are so backward and everything like that. Look how the way they treat women. And some Egyptian public intellectuals actually started writing books that said, hey, we need to reform our situations and everything like that. But the same people who said that, who used the sort of treatment of women as a justification for colonial policies, back home were against votes for women, say, in Britain. So there's a long history of Western powers using the subordinate position of women in Muslim countries as a way of interfering with them, while at the same time being very hypocritical about it, doing exactly the opposite back home. So it's actually fairly difficult for Westerners right now to have much credibility in criticizing Muslims saying, hey, you're doing this. There's usually the reply is going to come back saying that, well, okay, but look at what you're doing back home. And there's been a lot of that, say, for example, during the, say, Bush administration and things like that, where a lot of the slaughter in Afghanistan was justified by things like saying, oh, we're building schools for the women and everything like that. Well, yes, but you can sort of understand people over there looking at the schools for women in the context of bombs raining on them from the sky. So it makes it a little bit difficult. Go ahead.
So during your talk, you said something like, if every Muslim scientist were abducted, kind of the research community wouldn't notice. It's hard for me to believe, just given that there are so many Muslims. I mean, there's like 1.6 billion, so I was just wondering how you justify it.
Well, I mean, in terms of scientific productivity, it's fairly straightforward. Israel is a single country with a very insignificant population compared to the Muslim world at large. Israel itself is more important to many areas of science than Muslims at large. And this is not a controversial statement. Many, actually, conservative Muslims complain about the same thing, saying, hey, we need to do a better job. It's just, there's not a lot of scientific production in Muslim countries that are of high quality. I mean, this is not a very good metric, but say, for example, if you look at the Nobel Prize winners in sciences, I can only think of two that are Muslim. One is Pakistani, Abdus Salam, got a Nobel Prize in physics, I think for his work in the 70s, I think he got a prize in the 80s. And he actually ran into trouble back home because he belongs to the Ahmadi sect. And Pakistan does not recognize Ahmadis as true Muslims. So they're persecuted in Pakistan for their religious beliefs. They're considered not Muslim. There's a more recent Nobel Prize winner in chemistry, Aziz Sancar. He's Turkish from an Arab ethnic background. But again, it's very few in number. Then look at the number of, say, Israeli people who win Nobel Prizes. It's all over the place. Tony?
Ken, I just wanted to clarify, with regard to that statement, you were speaking specifically about Greek scientists practicing in Muslim countries.
Largely, yes.
Right, because of course there are many Muslim scientists throughout the world.
But actually, I think even if you threw that into the mix, I would still defend the statement that if there was a massive alien abduction, we wouldn't really notice all that. Most of actually immigrants from Muslim backgrounds who work in Western Europe and the United States in scientific fields are actually in applied science, not in basic science. It's very heavily the emphasis, because it's historically been that way. You'll find a lot more Muslim engineers proportionally than, say, Muslim physicists. Doesn't mean they don't exist, it's just a small number relative to, you're talking about a huge religion in the world. Right?
In Turkey, do you know if there's a trend of skepticism toward or denial of anthropogenic climate change linked to sort of conservative religious beliefs?
Not so much to speak of, because Turkey is still just a middle-income country. Their first priority tends to be actually, let's get further industry and, okay, let's plunder and pollute a bit more. And it's really those other guys in the already developed countries that they worry about. They cause the mess, let them deal with it. That tends to be the attitude. However, that's very broad brush, of course. Turkey, particularly in the process of improving its economic standing in the world,